Hello everyone, welcome to ASEAN Pacific Shows. In this episode today, we are going to talk about the China and Taiwan relations. It's a very sensitive topic and at the same time very current topic. It can even be said that about a subject that is one on the edge. Taiwan is a tiny island stuck between two superpowers, which is China and the US. It is talked about and discussed on various platforms every day, maybe even every second, every minute. We are going to talk today too, but we are going to deal with the topics in a very different way. We will approach to the topic in the perspective of history and identity. And at the same time, in a way, it can be said that our approach will be, we are going to talk about the background of the issue and the China-Taiwan relations. My guest is Dr. Simona A. Grano. Dr. Simona is a senior lecturer at the University of Zurich and director of Taiwan Studies Project at UZH. She completed her Ph.D. in Chinese Studies at Foscari University of Venice, Italy. She has held research position at taught China Studies and Taiwan Studies at her alma mater at the University of Zurich in Switzerland and National Cheng'chi University in Taiwan. She has also been a visiting scholar at the University of Hong Kong and is current research fellow of the European Research Center on Contemporary Taiwan in Tübingen and Germany of SOAS London. Simona's regional expertise centers on the People's Republic of China as well as on Taiwan and Hong Kong. She's author of the Environmental Governance in Taiwan and New Generation of Activities and Stakeholders, and editor of Civil Society and the State in Democratic East Asia, between entanglement and contention in post-high growth. Welcome, Simona. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Lokman, for the nice invitation. It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Simona, I'm going to start from the history, as our topic is already history. About Taiwan, how did Taiwan look like in 1945 in terms of culturally, economically, and politically? And even would you like to ask during the Japanese occupation and return to mainland?
Okay. So yes, we're taking the long tour because I do believe that to understand what is going on now, also from the perspective of geopolitics, we need to understand what was the past, right? And why is China so angry at the moment? What is going on has a lot to do with the past of Taiwan. So to go back to your question, in 1945, Taiwan was returned to the mainland, rather to the government of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. And we need to keep in mind that the China that had ceded Taiwan at the time to the Japanese, so in 1895, basically, the Qing Empire lost the first Sino-Japanese War and was obliged to give Taiwan as a spoil of war to Japan. And de facto, we know that Taiwan remained under the Japanese for 50 years. 50 years is a long time, and you can imagine that in 50 years, of course, Japanese imposed a dominion over Taiwan in many spheres, be it the cultural sphere or the political sphere. They also imposed it in the educational sphere, so that at the end of these 50 years, 5 decades, 70% of the people of Taiwan could actually speak Japanese. They were literate in Japanese. They had always been relegated to second-tier citizens. However, because Taiwan was supposed to serve as a basis for the Japanese Empire to, of course, maintain its expansion in Southeast Asia, it was also sort of constructed to be a model colony for Japan. So they instituted, for example, a railway system, a banking system, a postal system. Hygienic conditions were very high in Taiwan at the time of the Japanese rule. And all of that, of course, even though culturally speaking, the Taiwanese were never the same as the Japanese. However, we have to say conditions were very high. Taiwan was a modern country at the time. It had electricity, one of the first capitals in Asia. And that really generated a very big difference with what was going on in the mainland, because the mainland at the same time was torn between civil war between the communists and, of course, the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek's. There was widespread corruption. There was famine, cholera, and other rampant diseases. And all of that, of course, rendered the situation very much different. So that when Taiwan was actually returned to Chiang Kai-shek's China, because of course Japan lost World War II, what the nationalists found was, of course, a rather modern country in comparison to what they had left in mainland China. And that moment, of course, reinforced, or I should say, imposed a new division in Taiwanese society. You had a division, as I mentioned, already under the Japanese, but what came over with Chiang Kai-shek, of course, was a group of Chinese that were Chinese, just like the rest of the people of the island of Taiwan. Maybe I should say for reasons of sharing the knowledge that the island of Taiwan is inhabited by Han Chinese for almost 98%. And already at the time, the majority of the people of Taiwan were Han Chinese, but they had come to Taiwan from the mainland in the 17th century, especially because at that time, the island was under Dutch rule and they needed manpower. So that's when you have the first mass migration, right? And so to go back to what we were discussing, when, of course, Chiang Kai-shek and other groups of Chinese from all over mainland China fled the mainland and the communist rule in the hope one day of returning, they came to Taiwan and they found a population that had been, of course, Japanized, that had been, of course, literate in Japanese, and they wanted to sort of like re-sinify them or render them into loyal subjects of the Chinese motherland. And that was a very difficult thing because to a certain extent, Taiwanese had enjoyed some small freedoms under the Japanese. For example, you had local elections and they thought that they could keep that up also under the nationalists in Chiang Kai-shek, which was not the case. And when that was made clear to them, then there were widespread, of course, riots around the island of Taiwan against the nationalists. And that's especially a specific incident which took place on the 28th of February, 1947. And it is still known to these days as Arba-Shajian 228 incident in Taiwan, was the moment in which, of course, you really had the sudden realization that the mainlanders were there to stay. They represented not the culture of the motherland, but rather what they thought was an inferior culture to that of the Japanese, which they previously hated. And that moment really reinforced mutual distrust between two groups of Han Chinese. And this is also sort of like the beginning, we can say, of watershed Taiwanese nationalism, because that date imposed a deep chasm in Taiwanese society that for almost 40 years, this is also the moment in which the nationalists, in order to reorder society, recapture, of course, the order in Taiwan, in Taiwan, they imposed martial law and they kept it for more or less 38, 39 years. And so that moment really is the moment in which you got the creation of a wide rift in society between two groups of Chinese, those who came first and those who came later with Chiang Kai-shek. And that would really constitute a rift in society that you still feel to these days. So even in political camps between people that, of course, came over with Chiang Kai-shek and think of China as their motherland and hope, especially in the past, these are gradually dying out. But at the beginning, of course, these people all had one dream in mind, and that was reunification with the motherland. And another group of Chinese who had come to Taiwan much earlier, 300 years earlier, also from mainland China, but thought of Taiwan as their home, had been Japanized. And so, of course, it was a very difficult coexistence, I would say, of these two groups, which then really also had resounding effects in many other issues of politics, society, cultural sphere to this day, I would say.
Simona, I would like to make a comparison. What was the Taiwanese experience under the Japanese rules when compared to the other region of Asia under the Japanese occupy?
Well, I would just maybe briefly reiterate the fact that Taiwan was in a slightly different position than other parts because it wasn't just a colonized territory as many others, but it was really an experiment for the Japanese Empire. So it was an experiment in which they tested several policies, including cultural assimilation policies towards the last part of the Japanese domination period. And it also was an experiment where they, of course, tried to make Taiwan as livable as possible also for the Japanese troops and for the Japanese colonizer. And as I said before, it was also meant to be a model colony to showcase to the world. So if you put it and you look at it through these lenses and this perspective, you have to understand that Taiwanese profited because of this, but at the same time, Taiwanese were never equal to the Japanese. You have, for example, differences in wages, whereby a person that does the same job, being a Japanese or a Taiwanese, would have a 60% difference in income for the same exact position, meaning the Japanese would make 60% more for the same job. And other, of course, cultural diminishment. And there is a brilliant book that, you know, if somebody is interested in the story, in the history especially, I would recommend that you read. It's called Orphan of Asia, which was written by a journalist that really captures very well the different phases that Taiwan has gone through before, during the Qing Empire, and how this ambivalence, of course, being a part, loosely connected of the Qing Empire without really being part of it, because as I said, it was really just a loosely distant province. And then, of course, the change to being a Japanese sort of like a Japanese colonized territory, but never really being equal to the Japanese. And then, of course, the change once again under Chiang Kai-shek. And the book, I think the title already really captures it very well. Orphan of Asia really tells it all about how an entire generation of people in Taiwan felt lost because they didn't really know where they belonged. People like Li Denghui. Li Denghui is the first, maybe we will talk about him later, but just very briefly, he is the first democratically elected president of Taiwan. In 1996, he was elected by the people. He died last year and he was almost 100 years old. And he said, I thought I was Japanese until I was 20 years old. And many people of his generation thought of themselves as Japanese. So I think this is something that is very difficult if you come only from the mainlanders' perspective to understand, because they really simply have gone through very different social, political, economic experiences.
Let me, Simona, let me ask again about the Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang rule legitimization of the Kuomintang rule through the myth of Taiwan as part of divided China. And also, I would like to ask about national building project, syncretization, and U.S. recognition of Free China until 1979. What will be your observation or experience on what you can say on these topics?
Okay, so these are, it's a lot that we have now on the plate. First of all, let me start with trying to re-sinify the population in Taiwan, right? As we said, we left off the story by saying that when Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists came over, they find a situation that we're not pleased with, right? So they thought that the Taiwanese citizens had been corrupted by the Japanese. As I said, Li Denghui and his brother, for example, they had fought alongside the Japanese against the Chinese, right? So many of the Taiwanese were actually, of course, even involved in the Nanjing massacre. All of that reinforced mutual differences, so that the nationalists thought that they had to first and foremost re-sinify Taiwanese people, render them into Chinese. They had been corrupted by the Japanese. And they could do that in a variety of ways, but the underlying goal why they wanted to do that, on top of the fact that it would have been easier to rule over Taiwan if they had loyal subjects that felt Chinese, but the really underlying important goal there was reunifying China. No? This China myth, which is, of course, a very famous etiquette, which basically means that the government of the Republic of China in exile on the island of Taiwan under the nationalists kept up the pretense that they were the legitimate ruler of all of China, temporarily exiled. Taking this into consideration, this was the goal, that they wanted to actually recapture the mainland, and they needed help by the Taiwanese, right? So what they did is they instituted, first of all, as I said, martial law to keep order and control. And second, they also instituted a variety of cultural measures that rendered, or in the minds of the nationalists, had the secondary goal of render Taiwanese into Chinese. For instance, the Sinicization of time and space, which means that the calendar was made to start from 1911. This is the year of the Xinhai Revolution, meaning the beginning of the Republic of China on the mainland. And to this day, Taiwanese count like that. This is the 110th years since the establishment of the Republic of China on the mainland. Then they had, of course, other measures such as the maps and the history and the geography. Everything that was taught to Taiwanese pupils at the time was not about the island of Taiwan, but was about mainland China. So they had maps depicting the territory of the whole mainland China. And of course, in some parts of mainland China, they even included territories that now are not part of the PRC anymore, but used to be part of the ROC, such as Outer Mongolia, which is now an independent country. Then, of course, they would indoctrinate children with the thought of the founding father, Sun Yat-sen. As I said, they had, for example, weird peculiarities of, at the political level, having parliamentarians frozen in their seats until new elections could be held, because, of course, they had escaped from mainland China. And these people, they represented constituencies such as Xinjiang or Mongolia, which, as I said, Outer Mongolia was not even part of the PRC anymore, but they had no representation, for example, for Aboriginal people of Taiwan. Because something I neglected to say before is that actually the real true original inhabitant of the island of Taiwan are Aboriginal people of Austronesian origins, and to this day we have more or less 2% of the population of those. So all of these measures were actually sort of like meant to instill loyalty, to create citizens that would be Chinese again, not corrupted by Japanese ways. They also forbid the usage of Japanese, and also the usage of dialects like Hokkien, which is spoken by almost 90%, or rather 85% of the people in Taiwan, and Hakka, more or less 10%. And these were only allowed in private life, but certainly not at school. They imposed Mandarin, Guoyu, as it is called in Taiwan, and the language that was supposed to be the cosmopolitan language became American English, especially later on when you had a lot of rich, politically well-connected Kuomintang families that used to send their kids to study to the United States, especially in the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. Yes, maybe you have another question, otherwise I can go on as you wish.
Yes, you can go, there is no problem, but let me ask my question. I'm going to the Li Tenghui and the new Taiwanese identity. What will be your explanation on this period or process or area?
Right. Well, this is a very interesting phase for Taiwan, and he's a very interesting person because he was actually a Taiwanese, in the sense that he was one of those Chinese whose family had come to Taiwan in the 17th century. So he spoke Hokkien and Japanese. He could not speak Mandarin, not very well at least. He felt, as I said, for the first 20 years that he was actually a Japanese and not a Chinese. And he belongs to this generation of people and politicians that profited out of what happened also in a geopolitical context at the international level. What I mean by that is that in 1971, we know that the United Nations recognized the PRC as the legitimate government of China and not the ROC anymore, right? And a few years later, in 1979, the United States also decided to establish diplomatic relations with the PRC and drop their diplomatic official relations with the ROC. So, and this is the international level, you can imagine that these were big blows to the nationalists and to the China myth, because of course, the China myth, as I said, meaning that the ROC was the real legitimate government of China, but on exile, had been premised, sort of like martial law had been premised, an authoritarian control of Taiwan, keeping up this story. We are the real China, and we have to impose martial law and keep order because we have one underlying goal, which is recapturing the mainland, right? When in 1971 and then 1979, of course, international recognition came less, the nationalists lost part of their legitimation with the Taiwanese population and were seeking for other ways to legitimate their rule over the Taiwanese. And gradually, and also because of US external pressure, they started to first liberalize the country and then democratize it and lifting martial law. In this period of in-between phase of liberalization, you have at the cultural sphere and the political sphere a new generation of Taiwanese younger activists or younger politicians that were more cosmopolitan, could travel abroad, could see the world, like Li Denghui. And also you have a push for a nativization of Taiwan, for allowing also native Taiwanese and not just the mainlanders to be part of political echelons. So this is something that we also see going on in the party itself, in the Kuomintang, that started to nativize itself. It started to include, in order also to gain legitimacy, new fringes from the Taiwanese population. And Li Denghui was a young politician that belonged precisely to this camp and profited out of this slow opening, right? So when he became more established, he ran, first of all, he was appointed by Jiang Jingguo, so of course, non-directly elected to be the president of the Republic of China. And afterwards, when it was possible to give people the right to vote in 96, he was also directly elected by them, which prompted Beijing to protest shooting missiles in the 96 missile crisis, right? And he was paying, I would say, lip service, because he was a Kuomintang politician, to the underlying cause of unification. But in reality, he was a pro-Taiwanese independence, closeted independentista. Shelley Rigger termed him like that in a very interesting book, Why Taiwan Matters. The point of the matter is that his political ideas were very much akin to those that go today in the direction of a Taiwanese independence, or at the very least of letting Taiwanese people self-determine what kind of future they want, right? So when he came up, to go back to your original question, I took the long tour, but it's unavoidable. When he came to be more established, he started to realize that one of the problems Taiwan still really much had was a very much deep-set polarization in politics, between people who felt Taiwanese and those who felt Chinese, and those who felt both, and those who wanted unification, those who wanted independence, right? And that really actually made people fight each other very vehemently for many decades. And he wanted to mend the rift. And he came up with a variety of etiquettes. The most famous one is Xin Taiwan Ren, the new Taiwanese, which is actually an etiquette that he created in order to give legitimacy to one fellow Kuomintang party politician that then became the president, Ma Ying-jeou. But he was just merely articulating a change that was already felt in society. Namely, people were starting to realize that the situation had changed, even at the international level, as I said, with China now being the sole China. And so it was really something to be forgotten, put in the past, to have this division between those who came first and those who came later. He said, we are the new Taiwanese. We are all Taiwanese. Doesn't matter when we arrived here. This is our home. This is Taiwan. And so this is the etiquette that he created to sort of like justify these changes that were epochal changes that were taking place in society at the time.
Let me ask, I'm going to combine two questions, Simona. Process of desynicization and partial Japanese rapprochement. And second, was international or the US derecognition of the Taiwan is the catalyst for development of the Taiwanese identity?
Sorry, the first one is about desynicization, right? And the second one, the American support?
Yes, was international or the US derecognition of Taiwan as a catalyst for development of new Taiwanese identity?
Okay, so, well, I would say maybe I start from the second one. It makes maybe in terms of temporal order, it makes more sense for me. I don't think we can say that the US diplomatic establishment of diplomatic relationship with the PRC, and then of course dropping those with the ROC, was directly responsible for the creation of a Taiwanese identity, but it was one of the factors, as I said, which made Taiwanese people understand that the China myth that had been imposed on them was really just a myth, was really just a lie, right? And so if you didn't have to reunify with China, and we are not Chinese, what are we then doing, right? So of course, within the country, this really did push a lot of questions among the people, and people started to sort of like understand that they were different than mainland China. They needed to put an emphasis on that. So you have a lot of cultural movements as well. For example, in the literature, whereby rather than having just books written about by the early writers that came over, and there were very famous ROC writers like Bai Xianyong that came over from China and wrote about life in Chinese cities, you have a shift and an emphasis finally on, small life in Taiwan, in the countryside, an emphasis on agriculture of farmers and how they live their lives. You have an emphasis on fishermen, because Taiwan, of course, also has a lot of people that came over from a region of China, that southern Fujian, where they brought over a lot of maritime traditions, maritime deities and folk traditions and rituals. So I would say that US derecognition of Taiwan is certainly, you are right, one of the factors that pushed in this direction, not the only one. And the other question that you asked, this was about the desinization. Well, you can call it, sometimes people say it's a nativization, sometimes they say it's desinization. In a way, these two things are somewhat connected, but there's a difference in the sense that nativization really means just also emphasizing Taiwan, the Taiwanese people, putting them back at the center of inquiry. Desinizing the country really means sort of like keeping China at arm's length and sort of trying to really emphasize all the cultural differences in order to mark your difference from China, also for political reasons. And this has been done often on purpose by political parties, such as the DPP, especially under the presidency of Chen Shui-bian. He was a rather vocal, has also been accused of being a Han chauvinist, right, of diminishing and desinizing the role of China in Taiwan, renaming institutions by giving them, for example, Aboriginal names, using Aboriginal people, which had been neglected for a long time, to mark the difference from China. So for the first time, Aboriginal people get to have visibility again, but they are clearly politically instrumentalized in order to mark the difference from China, right? And so I think I would say there's a difference between, there's been on and off phases in which you have desinization phases. For example, as I said, Chen Shui-bian, to a certain extent, also during, of course, Li Denghui, everybody that has tried to emphasize the uniqueness of Taiwan and its difference from China. And then you've had phases of sinicization once again. For example, when Ma Ying-jeou in 2008 was elected for the first time, and then again in 2012, he was accused of doing exactly the opposite. So he reinstituted, of course, the study of Confucian classics and all the traditions that really do emphasize the unity with China and traditional Chinese religions and philosophy. And all of that was, all the names that had been changed by Chen Shui-bian were once back changed into names that reminded of institutions or figures of the mainland, and so on and so forth. So I think politicians have played with these two things, sinicizing and desinicizing the country for their own political motivations for a very long time, at least since the democratization of the island in '87.
Simona, in present day, what is the current situation? Is it possible to say more distinct Taiwanese identity developing? In Taiwan especially, is the people feel themselves just Chinese or Chinese and Taiwanese? What is the trend?
Right. So I would say that, the three traditional categories that you have to sort of describe the Taiwanese, how the Taiwanese population feels, are feeling exclusively Chinese, right? And these are mostly the people that came over with Chiang Kai-shek between 2 years, 47, 49, before, of course, they lost the war, the civil war with the communists. And this category is gradually dying out because a lot of these people are already too old or have died, and their offsprings have more weak link with the mainland because, of course, they are born in Taiwan and they feel the link with the mainland much less than their forefathers, fathers, or grandparents. Then you have a category of people that are exclusively Taiwanese. These are mostly, of course, the hardcore, sometimes connected, of course, to also the preference for the future of the country, meaning they prefer independence for Taiwan. And these are mostly, of course, in the southern and central part of the country, and mostly the descendants, it is not that black and white, but mostly for simplification reasons, the descendant of those that came over from mainland China in the 17th century. But some of those, of course, also feel both Chinese and Taiwanese, right? Especially those who might have one Taiwanese parent and one mainlander father or mother, right? So what has changed lately is, first of all, that you see a clear increase of the category of people that feel exclusively Taiwanese. In 2012, it was more or less 60%. But if you look at, this is among cohorts between 45 and 70 years old. If you look at younger cohorts, actually the percentage of people who feel only Taiwanese is even higher. It's almost in the 80% category, right? Then you have a very minimal category of people, more or less 2% by now, that feel exclusively Chinese. And then you have also diminishing of the category of people who feel both Chinese and Taiwanese, more or less 37%. If you ask me about the issue of Taiwanese identity today, I would say that it has a lot to do also with what is going on at the international level. We know that since Tsai Ing-wen in 2016 has been elected, and she has sort of refused to acknowledge the 92 consensus, which is a traditional position for her party, right? The 92 consensus is the consensus that says that there is only one China, briefly put, and Taiwan and China both being part of it, right? So she has refused to acknowledge that, and that was a precondition for Beijing to start talking to her. Since she has not done that, Beijing has retaliated with a variety of measures meant to isolate Taiwan at the international sphere, excluding Taiwan from a variety of international organizations to which it was previously allowed as an observer. During the Mind Your era, you had more friendly relationship between China and Taiwan. And so what you see now is, of course, at the international level, Taiwanese people see that there is a hollowing out, I would say, of this name of China for them, because what they had been taught is we are the real Republic of China. But now we see that the whole world recognizes China for the PRC. Nobody thinks of China thinking about Taiwan. We all talk about Taiwan now, right? So there is this hollowing out, which sort of like pushes Taiwanese people into a corner and makes them come closer to a Taiwanese identity rather than, of course, a Chinese identity. This is also visible in a variety of movements, I would say, or within the countries, by especially young people, but not only, who want more recognition for Taiwan. So they try to lobby in order to be able to participate with, you know, the name Taiwan, rather than, for example, Chinese Taipei, and so on and so forth, to sporting competition. There started a movement, I think it was in 2015, to change the passport and write Republic of Taiwan rather than Republic of China, which is the official name of Taiwan. So I would say it is a combination of factors, the changes within Taiwan, but also the changes at the international level by China monopolizing the name of China for itself, pushing Taiwanese people into a corner and making them identify much more with the name Taiwan. And on top of that, and then I give you back the word, is what has been taking place since 2019 with, of course, Hong Kong, the big protests for the, of course, first of all, for the extradition law, which was then in the end abolished. But then, of course, 1 year later, we know that the CCP has introduced the national security law, and de facto the one country two system formula, which had been implemented on Hong Kong, has come to an end. And the special constitution that was supposed to safeguard Hong Kong for 50 years, has also come to an end. And I think all of that has really given a boost to Tsai Ing-wen first, who was not faring that well after 2 years. And that made Taiwanese people, of course, rally compact behind her. And she was elected again for a second round in 2020. But also, I think that Taiwanese people can see that, you know, if this is our future and these rules or promises by Beijing have been betrayed for Hong Kong, that's also what expects us. And that in turn drives Taiwanese people even further away from China. And I think China is seeing this and is seeing now also what is going on at the international level with more support for Taiwan. In the European Union, we have seen parliamentarians going to Taiwan last week, Biden and Blinken making, of course, this statement about including Taiwan back into a variety of international organizations, also because of the model role that Taiwan played during the pandemic. all of that is really preoccupying to China, because China thinks that for a long time it had rested its hope in the fact that one day Taiwan would be reunified with China, because after all, the arch nemesis of the Chinese Communist Party, the nationalists, wanted exactly the same thing, reunification. But now suddenly the situation in Taiwan has changed, and China looks at that with increasing concern, thinking that Taiwan is probably moving from a situation of separation that it lasts, of course, since 49, to a really full-fledged divorce from China, which is something that is unacceptable for the Chinese for China.
Simona, I'm going to put a small question. When you're talking about these things, one question comes to my mind. What is the role of the political party in Taiwan on the identity, developing identity? You know, as a pro-independence party and Kuomintang party, what is their implication, their political implication on the Taiwanese identity?
Well, I would say that these two camps, which I mentioned before, which have really sort of like competed with each other, the Kuomintang and the DPP, stand on very opposing visions of the future and of the past. So one party, the pro-independence party, the DPP, stresses its peculiar history of Taiwan being always subjected to dominion of foreign hands. They stress, of course, that they were under Dutch colonial period. They were dominated by the Spanish forces for a while, by Ming loyalists, pirates, de facto, by the Japanese. And for them, also the Kuomintang is actually an alien regime that came to Taiwan to dominate them, not the motherland, right? And then you have the nationalists, which of course kept up the myth and the pretense that they were the real China. We are the real China, only temporarily in exile on the island of Taiwan. So we want unification. So clearly the impact of these two camps is really big, and they are really, at the beginning, they were really polarized at two completely extreme positions. You know, they were radically opposing each other. But the thing which you have to bear in mind in the case of Taiwan is the depolarization, I would say, has gradually converged in the middle, because Taiwan is a democracy, and by now both radical positioning are not palatable to the population, for obvious reasons. Because if you tell them that, you know, at all costs you'll reunify with China, this is simply, you know, unacceptable for a variety of reasons we have just talked about to many youth in Taiwan nowadays. So the Kuomintang has had to tone down its pro-unification policy and is really incapable to a certain extent of reinvent itself and reinvent a party platform that is not unification, which doesn't really work anymore. The DPP has similar problems with, you know, being too radical, talking about independence, which it did during Chen Shui-bian era, because that alienated a lot of people as well, because they realized that this is a too dangerous situation. We risk to you know, anger China, and we don't want that. You know, Taiwan is being pragmatic. They are for maintenance of the status quo. And if you keep yapping about, you know, becoming independent, that will really irritate China. Already at the time when you had Chen Shui-bian in power, even the United States told Chen Shui-bian and the DPP to tone down this policy, because of course China then implemented a law, the anti-secession law, which was also particularly meant at what was going on in Taiwan with Chen Shui-bian and the attempt to desinify the country. And so, of course, I would say that you start from this very polarized radical positioning, but these two parties have now converged in the middle. Clearly, what they still have in the party platform is that, you know, you still interpret them as being the traditionally DPP pro-independence platform, and of course Kuomintang the pro-unification platform, when, of course, not with the communists, but one day when China will be, you know, more democratic or more capable of listening to other voices.
I think when we're talking about the independence and the peaceful unification of separatism, at the same time there is a relation between Taiwan and mainland in terms of economy, tourism, and how we can say integration. That is why I'm going to ask one question about what is the current trend of economic integration with the mainland.
Well, so this is also something that took place, especially, I mean, we know that Taiwanese businessmen have been in China for a long time. A variety of companies that are famous all over the world, like Foxconn, are Taiwanese owned, right? But you have this issue of the Taishang, which are, to a certain extent, this means Taiwanese business people in Chinese, which are a constituent that is often talked about as, being not pro unification, but at least pro friendly relationship with Beijing, because of course they have an interest in keeping this friendly, amicable relationship so that they can continue to do business there, right? But what has gone on for a very long time is that the two sides have virtually no contacts, right? And when Ma Ying-jeou in 2008 was elected, he actually proceeded quite swiftly in the direction of more friendly relationship. And he also instituted a variety of economic agreements. A famous one is the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement in 2010, which simply put opens up the Taiwanese market and also the possibility for Taiwanese farmers to export to mainland China for a variety of sectors, including, of course, the agricultural sectors of Taiwan. And some fringes of Taiwanese society were quite happy with it because they thought they could export more, and it had some benefits, but it also had other effects. For instance, people got worried, first of all, that relationships were proceeding too fast, and that closer economic ties with mainland China would really signify that there was no way back, right? You had to sort of like reunify one day because they were becoming completely dependent, economically speaking, on China. So you have a few phases, I would say, especially under Li Denghui and now under President Tsai Ing-wen, where there is an attempt to diversify the economic situation from China. So the Go South policy of the Tsai Ing-wen government, for instance, but Li Denghui had a very similar one, are simply attempts to sort of like induce Taiwanese businessmen to not just look at China to invest, but to become less dependent, to also look at other options like Southeast Asian countries, for instance, right? And all of this, of course, has had an effect. Also, there was a secondary agreement, which was cross-strait service trade agreement, which was supposed to be passed after the first economic agreement as an ancillary agreement to that, and never passed because the Taiwanese population was quite worried and unhappy for a variety of other reasons. And this sort of like culminated in the 2014 occupation of the parliament by youth in Taiwan, which is known as the Sunflower Student Movement, who were worried that, increasingly tight economic ties, but also, for example, you have the possibility, and what they had seen in those years was a lot of media tycoons in Taiwan buying conglomerates and then investing in mainland China. And the fear was, of course, that they would be one day dependent, even in media reportage, by the censorship of the CCP if you got too enmeshed. So all of that is connected, of course. And I would say this ambivalent relationship that the Taiwanese authorities have with economic linkages, because they are aware of the importance of China for them and for the world. But on the other hand, they're also aware that for them, more than for other countries, there is not just the economic aspect. Switzerland is also interested in doing business with China and wants to keep amicable relationship. If they go bad, we lose a lot of money, but we don't risk our security. For Taiwanese, the prosperity security dilemma goes both ways. They are concerned about the prosperity issue, but they are also even more concerned about the security dilemma and the future if they get too enmeshed with mainland China, economically speaking.
Now, Simona, as at the beginning of the show, I said our approach will be different to the from others, like in the news web platform and others. That's why I'm going to add one more question about the Cold War, since our topic covered the Cold War period. A lot of academic discussion talking about the situation of Taiwan and legacy of Cold War in Asia. There is a Vietnamese example of as a divided country and the Korean Peninsula as a divided country. Can we call the Taiwan as a legacy of Cold War in this regard?
That's a very interesting question. Absolutely, I think that Taiwan is a legacy of the Cold War in its peculiar stages, right? I mean, Taiwan is de facto a country, but not de jure. And this is due to the fact, of course, that at the time when, of course, you had the Cold War, you had a sort of like a division in two blocks, right? So pro, of course, communism and pro-Western bloc. And in all of that, the support that the United States gave to Taiwan was really started in 1950 with the eruption of the Korean War. There are many scholars who say if that had not happened, probably Taiwan would not have been, part of the influence of the United States. They intervened to sort of save it from the PRC, who was ready to attack it, because the Korean War erupted and they realized that one more part of the world was falling prey to, of course, the Soviet expansion, the communist expansion. And so they needed to safeguard the bastion, what they call, in a very ironical way, free China for the whole Cold War period, to contrast it with the communist China, although we know it wasn't a free China at all. It was a ruthless dictatorship. But going back to your question of the divided country syndrome, right? It's absolutely true that you can equate the situation of the divided Chinas to the divided Germanys, to the divided Koreas, for instance. However, I would say that it is very different and very unique, because in all of these cases, even though these two parties might not have agreed with each other ideologically, some of them are still divided, like the case of Korea. However, they still interpreted each other as on par, on a equal status. They were in a situation of parity. But here we have a disparity situation in which a much bigger entity does not recognize Taiwan as an official interlocutor, because they say that Taiwan is not a state, but is merely a province of China. So I would say the divided syndrome arising out of the Cold War and this kind of comparisons are logical, but they don't really fit for these just mentioned reasons to the Taiwan-China case.
Thank you very much, Simona. If you have any comment for the current geopolitical situation, I will appreciate, but if not, that's okay.
Maybe one last comment. I think what we are seeing now, especially with since the advent of the corona pandemic and the fact that Taiwan has fared very well, of course, in mastering the corona pandemic, and now, of course, with the shortage in the semiconductor industry, of course, which we know Taiwan plays a pivotal role in, I think it's for the first time we see not only the importance of Taiwan in terms of the fact that, it has democratic values, but really also the fact that we finally start talking about Taiwan for the importance it covers in the semiconductor industry, in other words, in the global supply chain. And I think that, this sort of like highlights also and partly explains why the parliament in Europe and also other parts of the world, especially in the Western world, countries like Lithuania, countries like the United States, are now trying to harmonize the unfair situation, I would say, in which Taiwan finds itself today, by trying to push for more recognition of Taiwan at the international level. And this is partly also motivated, again, by economic reasons, but I guess Taiwan has to gain from that nevertheless.
Thank you very much, Simona. Thank you for this great information from the perspective of history and identity.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for audiences that have been with us until now. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share these beautiful shows with your networks and friends.